We're currently in the middle of a series exploring the FBI as it relates to the assassination of President Kennedy. In the last episode, we looked at J. Edgar Hoover, the man. In this episode, we analyzed the specific threats against President Kennedy that the FBI was aware of, but for whatever reason, did not pass on to the Secret Service. Were any of those threats credible? And did the FBI follow the normal protocols when dealing with them? Then we'll turn our attention to the FBI's relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald. When did Oswald first show up on their radar? Was Oswald an FBI informant? And what was the ultimate reason for the FBI's failure to warn the Secret Service about Lee Harvey Oswald's presence on the motorcade route?
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I don't know what this is all about.
Dallas police this morning resumed questioning the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? Commission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working I'm just a patsy.
This is Solving JFK. I'm your host, Matt Crumpton. In his 1991 book titled Act of Treason, The Role of J. Edgar Hoover in the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, author Mark North lays out an argument for why he believes that Hoover is culpable in President Kennedy's death. North claimed that Hoover failed to relay death threats against President Kennedy to the proper channels, specifically threats from the mafia. On February 9th, 1962, a wiretap captured a conversation between Philadelphia mob boss Angelo Bruno and his associate William Weisberg. The two men were talking about J. Edgar Hoover's recent gambling raid in Reading, Pennsylvania. Weisberg said, quote, "With Kennedy, a guy should take a knife like one of them other guys and stab and kill the fucker. Somebody should kill the fucker. I mean it. This is true, honest to God. I hope I get a week's notice. I'll kill. Right in the White House. Somebody's got to get rid of this fucker." This death threat by Weisberg against President Kennedy was reported to Hoover via Airtel. But instead of informing the Secret Service or the Attorney General, Hoover hid the information in the FBI's confidential files. On May 3rd, 1962, a wiretap caught Eddie McGrath, a New York crime boss who controlled Hell's Kitchen, in a conversation with an unknown woman named Jean. McGrath told Jean, quote, "If I could just hit Bob Kennedy with some kind of bomb that will explode, I would gladly go to the penitentiary for the rest of my life." Hoover took no action to notify the Attorney General about the threat on his life. In September of 1962, a more specific threat against the life of President Kennedy was brought to Hoover's attention. This information was the result of a meeting between Florida Mafia boss Santos Trafficante and Cuban exile José Alemán. And unbeknownst to Trafficante, Alemán was working as an FBI informant. The two men spoke about the Kennedy brothers, and Alemán told Trafficante that he thought Kennedy would be reelected, to which Trafficante responded, quote, "No, Jose, he is going to be hit." Alemán said that Trafficante made it clear to him that he was not guessing about the killing. Rather, he was giving the impression that he knew Kennedy was going to be killed. This threat that Hoover heard was from a high-ranking mob boss, and it had a concrete date on it, before the 1964 election. Still, once Hoover learned of this threat, he took no action to pass it on to the Secret Service, and the airtel was stored in Hoover's confidential files. In March of 1963, another FBI informant, Eugene De La Parra, overheard 3 men in a Carlos Marcello-controlled restaurant talking about killing President Kennedy. One of these men was referred to as the Professor, the same moniker that Marcello associate David Ferry sometimes used because he lied and told people that he had a PhD in psychology. According to De La Parra, the men were looking at an advertisement for a foreign-made rifle, and one of the men said, quote, "This would be a nice rifle to buy to get the president." This man added, quote, "There's a price on the president's head, and somebody will get Kennedy when he comes down south." De La Parra reported this information to the Philadelphia FBI office in September of 1963. Presumably, the threat was relayed to Hoover. Nevertheless, once again, no action was taken to notify the Secret Service or the Attorney General. So J. Edgar Hoover was aware of 3 death threats against President Kennedy and 1 death threat against Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Yet, he took no action. The Weisberg threat against the president and the McGrath threat against the Attorney General are notable, but for me, they can be written off as not specific enough and just being an emotional reaction to the Kennedy administration's crackdown on mafia activities. But the threats directly from mob boss Santos Trafficante and from associates of another mob boss, Carlos Marcello, were specific. President Kennedy would be hit before the election, and it would be in the South. In my view, Hoover's failure to flag these threats for the Secret Service, especially if he was aware of the De La Parra threat, are, at a minimum, gross negligence. The question is whether Hoover intentionally withheld the information, and I don't know the answer to that. Later this season, we'll explore allegations that the mafia killed President Kennedy. Regardless of where you land on that question, the reports from these 2 FBI informants do tend to support the idea that there was a mafia contract on President Kennedy's life in 1963. The strongest argument that Director Hoover had foreknowledge of the assassination appears to be his failure to pass on assassination threats to the Secret Service or to the Attorney General. But what about the idea that, independent of the death threats that we just noted, the FBI should have raised red flags on Lee Harvey Oswald when they were watching him? The Bureau kept tabs on Oswald with some regularity. He first surfaced on their radar in June of 1960 when Director Hoover wrote a memo noting that, quote, "There is a possibility that an impostor is using Oswald's birth certificate. And this concern seems to be legitimate given that Army Intelligence Colonel Philip Corso told Warren Commissioner Dick Russell that there were 2 passports under Oswald's name and they were used by 2 different people." On May 5th of 1962, Director Hoover sent a memo to the special agent in charge in Dallas that said, quote, "You should be alert for Oswald's return to the United States, and immediately upon his arrival, you should thoroughly interview him to determine whether he was recruited by Soviet intelligence or made any deals with the Soviets in order to obtain permission to return to the United States." When local Dallas agents met with Oswald to debrief him about his trip to the Soviet Union, he told them that he was not recruited by the KGB and that he just wanted to see the country. 2 weeks later, the FBI interviewed Oswald again. After that, Agent James Hosty opened a file on Marina as a potential KGB sleeper agent. Hosty would later tell the House Select Committee on Assassinations that the FBI was more interested in Marina than it was in Lee. About a month later, on August 16th, FBI agents met with Oswald for a 3rd time after staking out his apartment. After this meeting, the agents determined that Oswald was not violent. As a result, on August 30th, Agent John Fain closed the FBI file on Lee Harvey Oswald, but left Marina's file on pending inactive status, which meant that she would receive a follow-up in about 6 months. A week after that, Director Hoover himself forwarded Agent Fain's report on Oswald to the CIA with a note that said, quote, "For your information, I am enclosing communications which may be of interest to you." In March of 1963, 6 months since his last visit, Agent Hosty went to check on Marina Oswald, consistent with her pending inactive status. Hosty found out that the couple had been arguing a lot recently and decided to wait to speak to Marina. In the meantime, he ran a check on Lee's file. Hosty then reopened Lee Oswald's file because he learned that Oswald was a subscriber to the Daily Worker newspaper. After the file was reopened, the FBI would then continually monitor Oswald's activities, with dozens of FBI reports on Oswald between the spring of 1963 and the day of the assassination. As late as November 5th, 1963, the FBI was interviewing people around Oswald. On that day, they went to go see Ruth Payne. This interaction apparently led to Oswald dropping off a note for Agent Hosty at the Dallas FBI office on November 13th. According to Agent Hosty, the note said, quote, "If I did not stop talking to his wife, he would take action against the FBI." On the other hand, Nanny Lee Finner, the FBI receptionist who took the note from Oswald, said that the note said something along the lines of, quote, "Let this be a warning. I will blow up the FBI and the Dallas Police Department if you don't stop bothering my wife." Fenner was certain that the note was signed by Lee Harvey Oswald. She signed 3 affidavits confirming her testimony over a 3-month period when the FBI investigated the issue of the Oswald-Hosty note in 1975. According to Hosty, he flushed Oswald's note down the toilet on the order of his boss, Gordon Shanklin, the special agent in charge of the Dallas FBI. Despite Hosty's testimony, Agent Shanklin denied any knowledge of the note or ordering it to be destroyed. But HSCA investigators reviewed the incident and did not find Shanklin's denial to be credible. So if Shanklin did order this note to be destroyed, why would he do that? Shanklin knew that it looked bad for the FBI that Oswald had visited their office just 9 days before the assassination, and the FBI still didn't flag him as a threat. Keep in mind that Agent Hosty was aware that 1, Oswald subscribed to the Daily Worker, 2, Oswald was an ex-Marine and communist defector, or attempted defector at least, 3, Oswald went to Mexico City and made contact with the Soviet embassy, 4, Oswald was handing out pro-Cuba flyers in New Orleans, 5, where he was arrested, and 6, Oswald worked at the Texas Schoolbook Depository building. Hosty also knew, or should have known, that the presidential motorcade was scheduled to go through Dealey Plaza. Still, Oswald never made any threats against the president or the vice president, and Hosty had no reason to believe that Oswald was violent. So, for Hosty to have reported Oswald to the Secret Service, he would have had to disregard the idea that he thought Oswald wasn't violent and put all of that other information together to realize that there was a potential threat. We expect law enforcement to be able to do that, but as a practical matter, it's not that surprising that Hosty never told the Secret Service about Lee Harvey Oswald. Another key question when it comes to Oswald and the FBI is whether or not Oswald was an FBI informant. The Bureau addressed this issue directly in a January 30th, 1964 memo, finding that Oswald was not an FBI informant. According to the memo, there were no payments to Oswald, there was no background check of Oswald, which would be required to be an informant, and the number allegedly linked to Oswald was actually used by other informants. Quick sidebar on the FBI informant number. Warren Commission Chief Counsel J. Lee Rankin wrote a memo on January 24, 1964, which noted that there was an allegation that Oswald had CIA number 110669 and used badge numbers S172 and S179 for the FBI. Of course, FBI informants didn't have badge numbers, and as noted, informant number 179 was in use by someone else. However, according to Robert Story, a former CIA officer familiar with the CIA's numbering system, 110669 was consistent with how the CIA identified informers and sources. When J. Lee Rankin told the commissioners this information, he focused on the fact that 179 was not Oswald's FBI informant number, but Rankin never mentioned Oswald's alleged CIA number, 110669, or the fact that it was consistent with the CIA's informant and sources numbering system. Even still, the mere denial of the FBI and the Warren Commission of Oswald's status as an informant is not sufficient to answer the question of whether or not he was one. After all, if Oswald was an informant, it wouldn't be shocking for the FBI to deny it if they believed that it made the Bureau look bad. Indeed, Alan Dulles said the same thing in a closed Warren Commission session on January 27th. Specifically, he said, quote, "I think under any circumstances, I think Mr. Hoover would say certainly he didn't have anything to do with Oswald. So Dulles thinks Hoover would flat out have denied it even if Oswald was an informant. But is there any evidence to support this idea that Oswald was an FBI informant?" According to what former FBI agent Carver Gayton relayed to the Church Committee, Agent Hosty told him that Oswald was a potential security informant for an older FBI agent who had deactivated Oswald's file as an informant just before he retired. It would appear that Gayton is referring to Agent John Fain, who closed Oswald's file before he retired in the fall of 1962. Gayton said that Agent Hosty told him that Hosty was trying to reactivate Oswald as a potential security informant, but he wasn't successful in reaching Oswald to discuss that possibility. This idea that Oswald was once an FBI potential security informant is also supported by former FBI New Orleans clerk William Walter. Walter told the HSCA that when he was asked to check Oswald's file in August of 1963, after Oswald had been arrested, he, quote, recalled searching the indexes and finding a card that showed more than one file number, which would indicate that we had more than one case. From looking at the file numbers, they fell in the category of security type, informant type files. So if you're keeping score at home, that's one official FBI memo against Oswald being an informant, and two former FBI employees who say that he was. Official story critics also note that Oswald's behavior gives away the fact that he probably was an FBI informant. For example, when Oswald's taken into police custody after he gets in a fight with Carlos Bringuier in New Orleans, he asks the local police to call the FBI to come talk to him. If that wasn't strange enough, Oswald had the phone number for the FBI with him, which he gave to the cops. There's also the fact that Oswald was seen by numerous witnesses either at Guy Banister's office or talking to Guy Banister elsewhere, as we covered in Season 2. And remember, Guy Banister was the former special agent in charge of the FBI Chicago office who, according to Banister's former investigator Joe Oster, was able to easily get J. Edgar Hoover on the phone whenever he wanted. The counterpoint to all of these Oswald ties to Banister is that when you zoom in to each witness, you find that the witnesses aren't credible, even though there are many of them all saying the same thing. Warren Report defenders would argue that just because Banister could get Hoover on the phone, and because someone may have seen Banister talking to Oswald at some point, that doesn't make Oswald an FBI informant. And that's a fair point. But it still doesn't explain why Oswald had the 544 Camp Street address, which was the second floor office above Banister's, stamped on his Crime Against Cuba pamphlets that he was handing out. It's also true that some FBI agents had informants who were never formally recorded. These were called vest pocket informants. This is according to Agent James Gale, who was tasked by Director Hoover to investigate the FBI's pre-assassination handling of Oswald. If Oswald was this type of informal vest pocket informant, then there would be no written record. The core failure of the FBI in the JFK assassination was that it did not provide Oswald's pre-assassination file to the Secret Service. Oswald should have been on the FBI's security index because of his time in Russia, his handing out of pro-Castro materials that led to his arrest in New Orleans, and his alleged trip to Mexico City. These events should have triggered an alert when the Secret Service's Protective Research section asked for information on Dallas. That alert should have resulted in Oswald being removed from the motorcade route. It's hard to overstate how big of a deal this is. The FBI straight up dropped the ball, and if you believe the official story, that failure to put Oswald on the security index changed the course of history. Now, if you're a critic of the official story, the FBI dropping the ball on Oswald is also relevant because if Oswald is not in place in the schoolbook depository building, then that means there's no patsy. So the question is, how could Oswald build up this backstory that lets everyone know on the day of the assassination that he was a sympathizer with enemies of America, but also avoid having those same characteristics flag him as a threat to intelligence agencies before the assassination? So what happened at the FBI to allow this major breach in protocol? In November of 1959, Lee Harvey Oswald told the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that he would give military secrets to the Soviet Union. This led to the FBI issuing a flash on Oswald, which meant that anyone who received information or inquiries about Oswald was supposed to notify the FBI's espionage division. The purpose of the flash was to make sure that the FBI knew what potential intelligence threats were up to. This 1959 flash on Oswald was issued by FBI counterintelligence supervisor Marvin Gheesling. Gheesling was the man at the FBI who oversaw Oswald's file, along with fellow FBI agent Lambert Anderson. Gheesling also supervised the FBI's field investigation of Oswald when he returned from the Soviet Union. On October 9, 1963, Agent Gheesling canceled the flash on Oswald. The timing of this canceled flash is extremely important. That's because on the very next day, October 10th, the CIA sent a memo to the FBI about Oswald contacting the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. This information about Oswald's alleged Soviet embassy visit in Mexico City would become explosive after the assassination, but because there was no flash on Oswald anymore, Oswald was not placed on the security index, which meant that he was present on November 22nd to be either the shooter or the patsy, depending on your perspective. We have no proof that the cancellation of the flash was ordered by Gheesling's superiors. It seems to have come straight from Gheesling. Director Hoover censured Agent Gheesling after the assassination and wrote, quote, "Send this guy to Siberia" on Gheesling's censure document. So what did Gheesling have to say for himself? Is there a counterpoint for why he turned off the FBI alarm on Oswald on the literal day before it would have been triggered? Here's Gheesling's story. Oswald was arrested in New Orleans on August 13th, 1963, for breach of the peace while handing out Fair Play for Cuba flyers. As a result of that arrest, both Gheesling and Lambert Anderson signed off on a watch list document that maintained the FBI's flash on Oswald. Agent Gheesling claimed that the reason the flash was put on Oswald in the first place was in the event that he returned from Russia with an assumed name. Gheesling told FBI internal investigator James Gale that he should have removed the flash on September 7th, 1962, when Oswald returned from Russia without an assumed name. So Gheesling's defense is that he really should have removed the flash much earlier, and he just coincidentally happened to remove it on October 9th, which was the day before the alarm would have gone off in response to the CIA's memo about Oswald visiting the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. But this defense from Gheesling doesn't really make sense. As author Bill Sempich points out, the reason Oswald was put on the watch list, according to an FBI memo written on the day of the assassination, was to ensure that, quote, any subsequent arrest in the U.S. was brought to the FBI's attention. If the goal of the flash was to ring the alarm bell on Oswald after he was arrested, then why would the FBI remove the flash after Oswald had just been arrested? The bigger problem for Gheesling is that he says his October 9th removal of the Oswald flash was done because he just found out about Oswald's arrest in New Orleans, which Gheesling says triggered him to remember to cancel that flash. But the documents tell a story that is not compatible with Agent Gheesling's defense. As noted, Agent Gheesling signed off on a document to maintain the flash on Oswald on August 13th. Bill Sempich says that Gheesling's initials are also on two other documents about Oswald's arrest on August 21st and August 23rd. These documents show that Gheesling was indisputably aware of Oswald's arrest on August 13th. Instead of canceling the flash at that time, Gheesling signed off on a watch list document to keep the flash going. The only other defense that I've seen of Gheesling's action in canceling Oswald's flash the day before it would have been triggered is from Bill Sempich. Sempich hypothesizes that Gheesling became aware that Oswald was helpful to the FBI as an informant or otherwise. Because of that, Gheesling removed Oswald from the security list because informants don't belong on that list. Of course, while that argument helps Gheesling personally, it's not available to official story defenders because it implicates Oswald as working for the FBI in some capacity. Next time on Solving JFK, we wrap up our series on the FBI by analyzing J. Edgar Hoover's relationship with the Warren Commission, and we try to answer the questions of whether Hoover had foreknowledge of the assassination and whether Hoover was involved in a cover-up. If you heard anything that you believe is out of context, or if you have additional information to offer, you can let us know at solvingjfkpodcast@gmail.com. Please provide citations to the record for any fact that you're relying on. For transcripts, sources, and official podcast merchandise, visit solvingjfkpodcast.com.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas.
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Thanks for listening. Visit solvingjfkpodcast.com for more information.
I'm just